The first tenet, critical race theory, is the idea that racism is ordinary. It is not an aberration. It is not a distraction. It is not a deviation. Racism is the usual way to do business in Western society, specifically in America. It's a lot of misperception on what that means, and that is a hard truth that a lot of people find difficult to deal with. So this idea, the idea that racism, that there's a permanence of racism, as Derek Bell would say, that's attached to the United States, is that it's called racial realism. Racial realism. It's the straight up belief that regardless of how we look at the society, the good things that the society has done and the bad things the society has done, racism played a role in both of those things. To start it out, I know everybody wants to hear, what is critical race theory? The easiest way, like, start there. What is critical race theory? Well, first, what you got to understand is that it's not something that has like a very clear static interpretation, right? There is a definition of what it is, but how it's interpreted varies from thinker to thinker, right? And it is critical race theory is a set of tenets that we'll get into, right, that kind of outline the experience of people of color in this country and how it relates to the social structure, the legal structure, and other social institutions that people of color come into contact with. But it's a set of tenets, not one particular thing, not one particular definition, right? Critical race theorists operate from a lens that is defined by a set of tenets that break down how the role that race plays in the lives of people of color as well as white people in this country. And so the first question I want to ask, though, with that understanding, before we start getting into the tenets, is Toya, how do you feel about it having a definition, but not like, because I would argue it's not that it's good that it's not, it doesn't have that full interpretation, right? Because you can be someone that believes in certain aspects of these tenets, but disagree with others and still operate from the lens of critical race theory. And so I think that it's more strategic for it to not have a static interpretation as opposed to like, this is just what it is. What say you?
So I think that, and this is going to be opposite of what I said before we started talking, but I think our reasoning might be different. My reasoning for, I think it being good that there is some staticity and flexibility in how we come to interpret critical race theory, but that there are some common kind of, as we call them, tenets that hold it together, that become the appendages of that school of thought. I think it's good that there is not some linearity there and there's some flexibility and fluidity in that definition, because I think it speaks to the non-monolithic way that Black people, brown people, people of color have come to exist in this country, right? As debaters, I'll give you an example. If we go back to us debating issues of critical race theory in the policy debates we had in college, like, you would have Black people debating other Black people, and a lot of white people were like, wow, well, what are you all going to debate about? You clearly agree on everything. And it's like, no, actually, we have a lot of different orientations, perspectives, internalizations, orientations, priorities, methods of resolving issues of race and raciality in this country. There are a bunch of different things that are negotiable that we go through. We've seen that historically, right? The classic Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and the classic Booker T. Washington versus W.B. Du Bois, right? We've seen historically our revolutionary leaders not being in complete agreement with how but they understand the niggas come first. They understand that Black institution building is important and that Black people need to have control and power of things. To what extent and around what parameters they may disagree, but they understand that the interest and the needs and the prioritization of Black people ought to be of paramount importance to everybody who are stakeholders in the lives of Black people. And so, right, I think when we start to look at it from that angle, it makes a lot of sense that there are loose interpretations that change within generations, that change as we learn more about just kind of objective knowledge and where people came from and how things have come to be. There's just a bunch of different ways that shape and change and erode or compose of people's understanding and interpretation of what critical race theory is. But I mean, I asked the same question to you then. Why do you think it's a good thing that we have fluidity in the ways that it's interpreted?
But I mean, because it's and I, I apologize for using this actual analogy, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, right? and so, hey, Peter, don't cancel us. But that's just there's just multiple ways to go about doing these things, and so how people like perceive race and how they think we should go about solving the issues that race creates. We can have the same perception, but think that the solution is we have different approaches to the solution.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so when you look at even things like the way that, because a common argument is that, well, if it's loose like that, then they can interpret it any way that they want to, right? Like anybody can say it's anything. But I think when we have to deal with when we're literally talking about Black thought, it is non-unique to feel that what Black people say will be misinterpreted. That's gonna happen regardless.
Absolutely.
Right? How we present ourselves is not in our control. Blackness is subject to how it's interpreted throughout the racial hierarchy. So it being fluid serves more of a benefit to us, regardless of the different ways that they really attempt to try to say this is what it is. Mm-hmm. I mean, even though we will have disagreements of what it is and what it should look like, but that's cool, right? Because ultimately the end goal is still to create that lens to understand the ways that we are impacted by the social racial hierarchy, the way that social hierarchy impacts the law, etc. So that's the way that I would frame that. And again, so I guess I'll just say it's more than one way to do things.
Yeah.
when you have the same goal. My bad.
I mean, many roads lead to a destination. How about that one?
Okay, Maya Angelou.
Hey, listen, you mad? Are you upset? Yeah, I beat Dominique. I beat the plug in the poetry contest 15 years ago. He ain't let it go yet. He ain't let it go yet, man.
Hey, she came to my high school, man. I was the resident poet, man. Toya came to my high school and beat me in the poetry contest. I
come across the city on you. Listen, it's not a problem.
You know it is what it is. Okay. But so let's go ahead and get into the tenets, though. Let's get into what makes critical race theory. Critical race theory. We're gonna start with the first one, the one that I think is the most important, the one that I'm like, hell yeah, this is what we need to break down, and that is the idea. The first tenet, critical race theory, is the idea that racism is ordinary. It is not an aberration. It is not a distraction. It is not a deviation. Racism is the usual way to do business in Western society. Mm-hmm. Specifically in America, it's a lot of misperception on what that means, and that is a hard truth that a lot of people find difficult to deal with. And so this idea, the idea that racism, that there's a permanence of racism, as Derek Bell would say, that's attached to the United States, is that it's called racial realism. Racial realism. It's the straight up belief that regardless of how we look at the society, the good things that the society has done and the bad things the society has done, racism played a role in both of those things. Toya?
Well, before we really get into, because I think racial realism is a fact, right? And so I want to start to, when we start to, the same way we know that, like, I won't even go down that rabbit hole. I want to make sure we sit and really go back and shout out the names of the individuals who started this as a school of thought, who really started to sew these tenets together. And when we started to see this burgeon as a particular theory of power that we can start to rally around. So drop some of those gems real quick before we get into the rest of the tenets. It's just like, when did we start thinking about this? When did we start understanding racial realism as a functionality of our society?
Right. So you have Derek Bell, as we mentioned. He's known as the godfather of like they call him the intellectual godfather of critical race theory, and it kind of solidified in a work known as The Faces at the Bottom of the Well, the permanence of racism. And it was 3 legal papers that existed in legal studies previously that they compiled to create what's known as The Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And that's when he really starts to introduce his idea of racial realism and the role that racism plays and how we understand society as a whole, right? Even a lot of ways that we ignore. And so when you have Derek Bell, then you have Kimberly Crenshaw, who introduced the concept known as intersectionality, which speaks, and we're going to talk more about intersectionality and essentialism, or anti-essentialism, but she introduced the idea that our identities are not static, monolithic things, but matrices of intersections. You know what I'm saying? That make us who we are. And then you have Richard Delgado, who is an educator who produced the work known as Critical Race Theory and Introduction, which is a great way to first to kind of start to understand what these tenets are, and as well as some tools to help to actually help teach it in the class. You know what I'm saying? Even as you see people, trying to get it up out of there. And so those are the three that I've read the most to help me understand critical race theory. And like I said, if you want to get started, if you want to get a really basic understanding, I think the 5th edition is now out of Critical Race Theory and Introduction by Richard Delgado. So definitely, when you get the opportunity, check that out.
And just to place this on a timeline, this is like late 70s, early 80s, where we start to see a lot of these works formalize themselves. And so we've been looking at critical race theory as a theoretical academic lens of understanding race in this country for about, what that make it, about 45, 50 years, about half a century.
Yeah.
So, give or take.
Right. And to understand it from a depth a little bit further is that critical race theory stems from what was called critical legal studies. And it was when black legal thinkers started to look at the law from the perspective of the racial lens, the lens that really from the perspective that the law itself is racialized. And even critical legal studies stemmed from critical studies, which is a branch of philosophy that really discusses the role that labels and hierarchies play in society, and how those representations and hierarchies and roles are created, right? So critical race theory became a hyper focus on the experiences of people of color in the United States in a uniquely racialized standpoint. So when we talk about the role that race plays, racism being ordinary, right? That is a society that's built off a racial hierarchy, a unilateral racial hierarchy. It works one way, right? It's a ladder that only goes from the top down. And that climbing up shit don't work like that. The middle is negotiated, which that's a whole nother show. But the idea is that it's such a normal process that even like racism is something that we view as normal. As every day, just as American as apple pie.
So we did our historicization. I'm a teacher. Professor Green is in the building, so we had to go ahead and lay a framework. Now let's go back to these tenets. You talked about racial realism. What is another necessary component of critical race theory that has been articulated and categorized within this?
So the next tenet of critical race theory is the fact that racism in our society uniquely benefits white people. Racism uniquely benefits white people. So when you hear the conversation about, why white people can't experience racism, it's tied up in the fact that, like I mentioned, race is a hierarchy that works from top to bottom. White at the top, black at the bottom. Those two positions are like defined and are statically defined. Is how we should look at it, right? The top is white, the bottom is black. Everything in between is a deviation based on how close it is to either one, right? The model minorities, like certain Asian groups, are seen closer to the top part of that hierarchy, right? But then the demonized minorities, like migrants, undocumented immigrants, they are closer to the bottom of that hierarchy, right? But black and white are used to clearly define the racial hierarchy as it exists in the United States. And so the second tenet of critical race theory is understanding that whiteness uniquely benefits that hierarchy. Now, with racial realism and the existence of that racial hierarchy, a lot of people feel as if, right, that it can be disheartening. That type of information could cause it right. It makes them sad. It can cause them paralysis. People could feel like it's nothing that I can do because racism plays such a large role and it's so important or whatever. So Toya, I want to ask you, and I want to ask the chat as well. This operating from the standpoint that race is the reality of America, racism is a reality of American society, and that white people uniquely benefit from that racial hierarchy. Does it cause paralysis? Does it cause, or should it cause black people to not want to do anything or feel like there's nothing that we can do, right? The complete nihilism. If it's that bad, then we shouldn't do anything. Your thoughts?
I think it does cause a paralysis, and I'm gonna let you explain the paralysis that that occurs with black people. But I think for me, the paralysis that it causes, because it happens on both sides. I think for white people who are forced to deal with the implications of whiteness, it caused them to kind of give up their hands, like, well, what do you want me to do? Like, I can't choose my grandparents. Like, what do you want me to say? If I'm just always if you're just always gonna blame everything on me being white, then why should I even try to like be empathetic to what you're saying? Because even if I do all of this work over here and I talk to the black person at work and I say hi to my black neighbors and I talk to that, I could just have this one instance at a grocery store and now I'm just some white guy, right? I'm just, none of that matters. And so I think that gets them so frustrated, right? Because I don't think, as much as we call white people stupid, right? I don't think they're really stupid. I think they end up resolving with stupid shit because they're able to play dumb, play stupid, play ignorant, and they pick the easiest path that allows them the most plausible deniability or the ability to just like link themselves from being implicated in the to not do any hard work, right? And so I think in that world, the paralysis that we talk about for white people exists in a world where they just are like, I don't know. They just throw up their hands like, well, what do you want me to do? I didn't choose it. I didn't pick it. I didn't get you off the boat. I didn't put you on the plantation. I just,
nobody alive is responsible for slavery.
And so that's why that gives them a reason to, you know, make excuses for themselves and for other white people to not hold them accountable, to not make hard decisions, to not be a part of hard conversations, and to not decenter themselves. It's because they just feel like, I didn't choose this life. It chose me. Sure.
Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. I don't think that the information in and of itself is what is causing this paralysis. Shout out to Vance. He said it's wild they act like chattel slavery wasn't literally legal and just the same as other identities were escorted into white. There were others shoved into Negro as well.
Hello?
Right. That's facts. Especially like indigenous communities. They called them niggas with the quick. They called them niggas with the quickness.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I mean, let's not forget about. I was just gonna say indigenous people and then colorism that exists amongst, you pick a racial category, dark. That's you heard the plug say specific Asians get access to model minority status. What is meant there is that the darker you get, right? Indians are Asians. Did y'all realize that? A lot of people think Asia is somewhere else. It's right there. I'm sorry, you think India is somewhere else. It's right there in Asia. And they half the time don't even get access to their Asian identity. Only recently have we been talking about Pacific Islander, Indian, and other races when we start to talk about the Asian identity. And that's because recently, the darker you are, right, the less kind of access to that particular understanding. Let's talk about Latinx culture, right? We already got Afro-Latinos. Let's not even, they could have a whole conversation about them themselves, and the complicated nature of where the boat drop people off. Right, you just speak a different language, but we was cousins, except for I just stayed on and you got off. And then we also deal with the colorism that exists in Mexican cultures, right, and even cultures that have European connections and descent with them. So there is a lot of weird stuff going on in terms of how people see how the spectrum nature of who gets pushed where.
And the reason why that stuff gets maintained is that people act like there's something that's stopping them from actually addressing these things, but the real issue is calling out y'all what you benefit from.
Right.
Like as a man, I can look at the fact that I benefit from male privilege, right? My blackness kind of alters that privilege, and we'll talk about intersectionality here in a second. But I can admit that it actually I get a privilege from being a man without saying that, you know, as a black man I occupy the same space as a white man and get the same privilege, right? So now that the idea that there's a paralysis, that paralysis simply comes from the people who are benefiting from certain structures in the system not really feeling like wanting to call it out. They cool with having that benefit.